Thank you for joining the second town hall in our Back to School in the Time of COVID series. Tonight's guest is Deann Burtch Puffert, CEO of Childcare Aware Washington. We've collected questions through social media and constituent mail, and we'll be using those questions to drive this discussion. If you're watching this live on Facebook and have a question, please ask it in the comment section of this video, and we'll answer questions from live viewers as well. Before we get to questions, I'm going to hand it over to Congressman Heck and then Ms. Burtch Puffert for opening comments. Congressman Heck?
Lauren, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us for this, believe it or not, our 23rd episode in a series of town halls regarding our state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Just as a brief program note, I'll repeat it later. Our next one is scheduled for Monday, August 31st at 5 p.m. with our first repeat guest, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reichdahl, will be back with us. Again, that's Monday, August 31st to go live at 5 p.m. But tonight we have Deann Burtch Puffert. She is the head of Childcare Aware of Washington. Tonight's topic is childcare. She comes to us as a Western Washington undergraduate, a University of Washington graduate, and fun fact about Deann, a part-time fiddler, bluegrass and symphony. So if the conversation drags, we may ask her to unpack the fiddle. But for now, what we want to talk about is something way more serious, and that's the issue of providing childcare to Washington state families. This is integrally involved in the issue of providing education, and it is one of the biggest economic challenges that families can face. Before we get into the specifics, however, Deann, I'd like you just to explain to people what Childcare Aware is.
I'm glad to do that. Thank you so much for having me today. Childcare Aware is a really interesting organization. We serve and support childcare providers across the state of Washington, all licensed childcare providers. We work with regional partners that are local in each of the regions across the state of Washington to provide coaching services to assist providers in their practices and the work that they do. We also run the statewide call center, which is focused on serving families and helping them to identify care and to find the services that they need. We provide referral to all licensed childcare providers across the state. We also work with caregivers, family, friend, and neighbor caregivers around supporting them in meeting the needs of children that they are caring for. Many people don't realize, but most of Washington's families use family, friend, and neighbor caregivers in one way or another, aunties, uncles, grandma, grandpa, to meet the needs of their ability to go to work and to school, and we support them as well. We do advocacy and education, and we provide data reports that help inform legislators and the DCYF around the challenges that providers and families are facing.
DCYF, we have a ban on acronyms here that the viewers might not know intuitively. DCYF is?
The Department of Children, Youth, and Families.
Very good. And you indicated that if I am sitting here in some random city, let's say Olympia, because that's where I am sitting, and we all of a sudden find ourselves with an absence of childcare that we had, one of the places I can turn to is to call your call center, and you can give a list of local childcare providers. Is that a 1-800 number?
Yep, 1-800-446-1114. And we're also online at childcareawarewa.org, and you can find information there. I think just to put a finer point on the point that you're making is we can also talk with you about what will really meet your needs and help you suss out and narrow it down to be more than just location and price tag. We can also find a program that reflects your family values around, if you want a faith-based program, we can help you with that. If you would like a provider that speaks Spanish, we can help you find that. So we can even dig deeper than just sort of that top level list of providers in Olympia.
Deann, how do we differentiate between childcare and early childhood learning, or somebody who's offering something called a preschool versus childcare? Both presumably keep students or children engaged and stimulated, but is there a distinction?
You know, some people might say that there is, but my belief is that children are learning all the time. And so therefore, any time they are in a learning environment, be it childcare or preschool, they are learning from that experience. So I think a lot of times we get caught in this idea that learning is about cognition. But we all know that learning is about more than that. It's about learning how to get along with others, how to practice controlling my body and the ways I show up in a group situation, how I respond to the authority of a leader or a teacher in a classroom. All of those things are happening all the time. And I would say quality childcare is equal to a learning environment, much like people tend to think of preschool.
Well, I guess the question would be if somebody called you and they had a need, would referring them to a preschool be on your list as well as more traditional, what we think of as more traditional childcare setting?
Yeah, we also support preschool, which many people think of as part day. We are able to refer to that, and we also are able to refer to co-ops if that's what families are looking for. Right now, that doesn't seem likely given the pandemic, but in typical form, we're able to support that as well.
So one of the questions I would always like to understand, or ask and understand is the nature of the landscape, by which I mean, can you characterize this large, decentralized, pretty varied offering of services? You mentioned that uh, family and friends and neighbors is the single largest component, but can you give some data to help people understand the nature of the market?
Sure. So there definitely are areas of the state that have enough childcare, and there are a number of areas of the state that don't. I know that there are 15 counties in the state of Washington that are considered childcare deserts, where there's not enough childcare to meet the needs of the families that need it in that space. So childcare is available to a greater or lesser degree across the whole state. Where we tend to hear about a lot of challenge in finding care is for infants and toddlers, birth to 3. That is where we have also another place where there's a fair amount of shortage. And during the pandemic, we have gone back and forth with having enough school age care in some areas. In some areas we have enough, in other areas we don't. It really does depend. One of the things that the pandemic has done that's really interesting is parents have their own barometer for when they're ready to return to work and utilize a group care setting. And that's been really hard to predict during this time. So when you ask if there's enough care out there, I can say that there's enough care now. I think the longer that this persists and families return to a more normal cadence around balancing kids being in out of home care, we might see some challenges into the future.
I had a Zoom conference call with a statewide group of childcare providers here not that many weeks ago, Deann. One of them was headed out the door, had to close their business because of an absence of children. The rest were all down significantly and didn't feel as though they could hang on that long. I came away with the impression we're in a world of hurt here. Can you describe that? Because
I couldn't agree with you more. The challenge that we're facing right now is that families are keeping their children home and providers are trying to hold on until families return. And that is not meshing very well. What you're describing is that it's not meshing, the timing isn't meshing very well. We have a lot of providers who are struggling with meeting the fixed costs that they have. They are trying to hold on to teachers in the hopes that the families will return, and because it's hard to hire teachers and hire quality staff. So it's really hard right now for everyone. Families are struggling to figure out, okay, do I go back to childcare and take some risks? And providers are in, having retooled and done everything they need to do to practice the social distancing, have masks, do all of the cleaning and the separation, and they're ready. and feel ready. And it's just not matching up. It's a real problem in the state. And I worry about the economic recovery of the state if we can't get this, if we can't maintain the childcare community, so that when it is time for many of these parents to go back to work, there might not be a childcare market to be had.
Some would say that even before the pandemic arrived, we were on the verge or actually already in a child care crisis. Would you agree or disagree? And if so, why?
I would definitely agree. Again, especially in some areas of the state and in the birth to three realm, I have heard so many stories of families getting on a waiting list for their infant only to get the slot when the child is 3 years old. And so that tells a really big story about the challenges that that families are facing around having, enough care.
So that's the access side. I
Yeah.
can't help but wonder if there wasn't already an acute and serious affordability side as well.
Absolutely. I speak about this all the time. And it's made even worse in the midst of the pandemic. Families who fall above the Working Connections childcare eligibility criteria, which is 52,000 for a family of four, in many areas of our state are not earning the living wage that would allow them to be able to afford to pay for childcare out of pocket. In some regions, in the sort of Thurston, King, Snohomish run, somewhere in the $70,000 to $80,000 a year is what a family needs to be able to pay the full cost of childcare. And so between that 52,000 and that 80,000 are these families that are faced with just overwhelming challenges around affordability and access to childcare that is unmet. And so the recent report that was released by the Child Care Task Force talks very eloquently about the challenge around affordability, where families say, I'd love to purchase childcare for my children and have a single solution to having a space that consistently is where my child could be dropped off and cared for. I just simply can't afford it. So I pieced together care to avoid having to pay. And that brings a lot of stress and challenges to families, young families today in our state.
You have a gift for understatement. Can child care providers provide child care now safely?
I got asked that by a friend of mine who I was having a socially distanced outside dinner, and I would say definitely if you do your homework and you really check out that they have a clear plan. If you drive by childcare programs, if you're out and about, you'll see families dropping children off at the curb, not entering into the program to add additional exposure, germ exposure. I feel that childcare providers have done the job they need to do to make this space as safe as possible. Obviously, it's not without its risks. So I don't want to sort of unequivocally say, everything's perfect. But I think they've done everything they can to create an environment where kids can be safe. That said, the other side of being safe, I think, is having good mental health situation going on. And for many children, I think being in a setting where it is focused on them as children and their growth and their, being able to be in play and engage with other children cannot be understated as something that I think children really need in their lives. And I think, for the past 6 months, many kids have been sort of, kept inside, kept with their families. And that's all been well and fine. I don't want to dismiss that. But at the same time, children also they're social beings just like we adults. And they don't do Zoom calls, So I think there's something to be said for having children get back into an environment that's focused on their needs and supporting them to have their time.
I've yet to see a 4-year-old who would keep a mask on for 6 hours, but that's another story. Lauren, why don't we go to a couple of the questions that were submitted?
Excellent. Our first question comes from Kate, who is watching live. What about part-time care? Can you find centers that offer that? Ms. Burtch Puffert?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think definitely call our family call center, the number that I gave in the website. I would give a
Deanne,
call.
would you give it again, please?
Sure. It's 1-800-446-1114. Definitely call and they can do a search for you and find options for you that are part-time. Finding part-time care can be challenging, particularly if your child is birth to 3. It's less difficult if you have a preschooler, and school age as well. You can find part-time care. But we can definitely do a search for you that would narrow that list down to possibilities that would offer part-time care.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Antoinette, who is watching live. Her question is, what kinds of support can you give to grandparents who care for their grandchildren while parents work? I have 2 school age, a preschooler, and a 7-month-old I watch, and engaging them in meaningful learning is difficult. Ms. Burtch Puffert?
Definitely. Again, I would call the call center and ask them to be referred to what we call play and learn groups. They have a number of play and learn groups that they're offering for free virtually, which include a story time, an activity, materials, so that it gives you something to break up your day. I don't know where you're located. That's why it makes it a little bit more difficult, but depending on where you are, we have a number of play and learn groups that are offering virtual services that do they really have wonderful programming that could support you.
Antoinette is located in Olympia, Washington. We know this because, well, she's a rock star. I think she's been at every one of our 23rd town halls. She always has a good question that is relevant to the subject. Antoinette, welcome back. Lauren.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we definitely know there's play and learn groups available that are offered virtually in the Olympia area. So we could get you to one of those.
Excellent. This question comes from Dawn, who is watching live. My daughter works with 15 special ed preschool age children. Social distancing and masks are impossible. Comments? Ms. Burtch Puffert?
Wow, that's a really tough one. Usually in childcare where you're serving children with special needs, is that the focus of the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to be sure. Definitely we have childcare programs that have expertise in serving children with special needs. Usually they're not in a single classroom with only children with special needs, and that's both the good and the challenging part, I think, of childcare is that they do a mixed audience, which is good, I think, for everyone when it's done well. And I think that I know that there are a number of providers that focus on building their skills around serving children with special needs in a mixed environment where everybody can learn together. So that's something, again, that our call center has information about which providers have that level of expertise to be able to really serve those children well and their families.
I heard Don to say that his daughter actually does that right now with 15 special ed or special needs students. Don, do me a favor, please thank your daughter for what she does. This brings up, I think, an opportunity. I am prompted to give a commercial for us each to do all we can to beat this virus. We know that if we employ best practices, keep socially distanced, wear a mask, frequently wash our hands, do all the common sense things that we know will work, that the public health officials are recommending that we do, that we see were employed more aggressively in other countries and drove the infection rate way down. If we do that, we can beat this virus, or at least hold it at bay in a reasonable way until such time as a vaccine is developed. Each and every one of us has a responsibility to do this, and it will help all of us. It will help keep all of us safer. Lauren.
Thank you. This next question was sent in by Mandy in Olympia through constituent mail. Childcare is expensive, but a necessity. When you have 2 children in daycare, you're spending more on daycare than on a mortgage. The $5,000 childcare assistance tax credit is meaningless. I spent $5,000 in the first quarter of the year. We need subsidized daycare or a greater tax break. We were struggling before this pandemic, and now we are making impossible decisions. Pull our children out of daycare while we are home and lose their slot, or keep them in daycare hoping no one becomes sick. I'm asking that you include in the next stimulus help for working families to pay for daycare and help daycare centers stay open. Congressman Heck?
Thank you, Mandy, very much for the question and for the request. But let me tell you, we actually just did that. We passed a bill called Child Care is Essential, prime sponsored by a Congresswoman from Connecticut named Rosa DeLauro, which would provide $50 billion in child care grants to help child care providers get through this period of time. We simultaneously passed an increase in that child care tax credit. It is now over in the Senate, frankly, Mandy, like a lot of good bills, awaiting action on Mitch McConnell's desk. But we heard you, and I couldn't agree with you more. The idea that people have to pay nearly what they make in order to provide childcare for their children, or face the choice of staying home and losing that income and having perhaps their marketability, their job skills atrophy while they're providing childcare for those few years. This is a Sophie's choice, if you will. This is an unbelievable burden on families, and we have to figure out a better way in this country with as many two-parent working families or single-parent working families to enable people to provide quality childcare for their children. We simply have to. I bet you would like to add to that, Deann.
I was going to say, I just can add a personal anecdote that I think is interesting. I had my first daughter in 1990 and my second in 96, and the flexible spending account allowable amount was $5,000 back then. And so now that my daughter is 30 years old, the amount is still the same, despite incredible increase in costs. And I just think I rarely hear a parent raise the issue of the flexible spending accounts, and I'm really happy, Representative Heck, that you've supported something to make a change around that, because I think it will really help middle income families.
Thank you. This next question comes from Frank, who is watching live. I'm having a hard time understanding how schools are repurposing closed schools as childcare centers. How is this a safer situation? Ms. Burtch Puffert?
You know, that was one of the conversations we had this morning. First off, one thing I would say is that schools have supported and had childcare in them for many, many years now, providing before and after school care. And so some of those settings are just operating in the building where they regularly would have operated anyway. I think the question becomes really confusing when they're expanding childcare in the same building that they've shut down. And I think it's just a challenging question of trying to balance. I think it was before we were on air, talking about how to balance, do we keep, do we make it so that we don't do any services and shut everything down and have families struggle with trying to get to work, or do we find that balance point? And I know that we're trying to figure out what that balance point is, and it is confusing, very confusing.
I think American families are confronted with an unbelievable, difficult choice and challenge.
Yes.
And frankly, in large part, unless you're a very high net worth individual, it doesn't matter. If you're an essential worker and you must work, you're in all likelihood not making a high wage. And if you have children at home, that means, what am I going to do for childcare? The great expense that was here even before the pandemic hit, now the increased difficulty of finding a place for them to go to often. But if you're not an essential worker, perhaps you're somebody who can work from home, you have one of those kinds of jobs, you may very well be making more money, but now you're in your home with your children who are distance learning from school, and you're trying to both work at home and supervise their education. For people who have children in home, especially small children, there's no good circumstance here during this pandemic.
Thank you. This next question comes from Katrina, who is watching live. Schools are overcrowded and there is no funding to build more schools, specifically talking about Bethel School District. The schools have constructed portables and are currently using teachers' lounges and resource rooms as classrooms in order to attempt to keep up with the constant influx of students. This is obviously nothing like the safe spaces you were describing. It is physically impossible to keep that many students at a safe distance, and this puts elderly teachers like my mother at severe risk of contracting COVID and causing a surge of cases in children. What are your plans, if there are any, to combat this? Congressman Heck?
Well, the Congress, in fact, in the HEROES Act, which passed in May and sent to the Senate, where, like, again, a lot of other bills, it's circling over the top of Mitch McConnell's desk, provided a significant amount of money to help public schools, including with some infrastructure. In addition to the HEROES Act, more recently, we passed another bill called Moving America Forward. It was a massive 1.5 trillion infrastructure bill, and it included a significant amount of money to rebuild America's schools. Probably the quicker or the faster solution would be to successfully engage in a bond campaign in Bethel. I know that they have proposed them in the past to keep up with the growth there. In fact, I even went so far as, even as the member of Congress representing the area, to lend my name in support of that because of the need that you have described. You're absolutely right. They need more money, they need more resources to provide adequate facilities. And there are a variety of ways in which that may happen. None of them are going to happen overnight, however.
Thank you. We have one last question, and then I will turn it over to you both for some closing thoughts. This question comes from Bryant in Tacoma and was sent in through constituent mail. From the time our son was 1 year old, he has attended a childcare facility that costs about $12,000 a year so that my spouse and I can both work. We were looking forward to his starting kindergarten this fall in Tacoma Public Schools. Instead, he will be attending his current childcare and taking classes online, and we will be spending an additional $12,000 on childcare. I am asking that the government take into consideration the massive unexpected financial burden and consider some type of relief, credit, or subsidy to help families for whom public schools is not just an education, but also a childcare. Congressman Heck?
Ryan, thanks for the question. That's in fact why we passed that increase in the child care tax credit that I alluded to earlier. And we will do our best to lobby the members of the United States Senate to take it up and to pass it, to deal with situations just like yourself. Yet another example of a heartbreaking hardship that has been visited upon us as a consequence of the pandemic. I suspect, however, that the quicker resolution to this is if we get control. That's not the right phrase. We're never going to get control of the virus. But if we start beating the virus, insofar as we've adopted those best practices that will drive the infection rate down so that we can safely open schools, so that you can have a kindergarten for your child. I hear stories like this, Bryant, every day from people who have been impacted. There is a lot of pain and suffering, in our state. People are losing businesses that they've had for years, if not decades, in which their majority of their net worth is tied up in. People losing jobs that they've just had. People are being affected in very, very significant ways. And the surest way that we can deal with this is to get on top of the virus. Deann, do you want to add anything to his story, which I'm sure you've heard over and over and over again?
Yeah, my heart really goes out to families who have really moved into the space of school, serving as between the bus ride on both ends and school itself. You basically can have 7 hours of coverage for while you go to work, and then you piece it together on the other ends, and have been operating for a while with no childcare costs. Your situation is challenging as well, for sure. And I guess the thing that I just keep coming back to is, there's no one right answer for every family. And I think that in as much as we can acknowledge the challenges families are facing, as the Congress can consider solutions and ongoing support that can help families in the midst of lessen those hard decisions, especially the financial ones that are being made. I really appreciate the leadership of people like Congressman Heck that really do dig in and listen to their constituents and hear their stories. And I can just tell that there's a real sense of heart heart around the work and the need to make it better. And I think we're all just trying to pull together as best we can to create solutions that'll work for the families of Washington State.
Well said. Lauren, did we finish our questions?
Yep, that was our last question.
Deann, is there anything you want to add that hasn't been asked about, or anything that we have said that you want to repeat, including the 1-800 number, I might add?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the 1-800 number, 1-800-446-1114. And I guess the thing that I really want to say is I really believe that childcare providers are some of the heroes of the pandemic. I think frequently we focus on all the essential workers of people on the front lines and all that, but many of the people on the front lines are at work because of childcare providers. And so I just want to celebrate for a quick moment the incredible work of the childcare community during this time of pandemic, a desire to meet families where they are and to meet the needs of their children so that they can have what they need to be able to go to work and make a living. I just feel like they're one of the unsung heroes during the pandemic. And then the other thing that I just want to reiterate is that there is support out there for considering your choices. Again, the 1-800 number that I mentioned, please call and just talk about, there will be a family representative there. They can just talk through what your choices might be. You might not be ready to do anything, but just sort of check out what's possible. And our staff are there ready to talk with you so that you know what might be available, so that you can consider that, maybe not today, but maybe in a couple of weeks when that feels like the right time. So please don't be shy about calling just to ask questions. You don't have to be ready to roll. We're here to listen, to ask questions about what's important to you and your family and help you figure out a good solution.
Thank you, Deann, very much for mentioning the work, the sacrifice, and the value of what child care providers do. It probably should be mentioned that there is heightened risk for them, because anytime you're around other people and that proximate of a location, we all know that you're not going to stay socially distanced from a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old throughout the course of the day. And we all know they're not going to keep their mask on all day in all likelihood. So they're not only doing something vital to that family, they are increasing their own risk, no matter how religiously they adhere to their own personal behavior as it relates to best public health practices. So well put, Deann, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here and talking about this very important issue that is critical to every family, to say the least. It deals with the most important thing in their life, their children. It doesn't get any more important than that. Every parent knows it, every aunt, every uncle, and certainly us grandparents know that. So thank you. Deann Burtch Puffert of Child Care Aware, thank you for being here. Thank you all for joining us and giving of your most precious commodity, your time. Once again, you can join us next Monday, August 31st, for the third in our 7-part series with returning guest, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reichdahl. Some would say, being the State Superintendent of Schools, the second most difficult job in the state of Washington right now. And I don't know that I could disagree with that at all. But he'll be here on the eve of the return of school starting, mostly in distant learning mode, but some perhaps otherwise, to talk about what they are doing, what can be done, and what resources might be available, and what the outlook might be. I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, wear your mask, maintain social distance, wash your hands, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you for joining us.